This week, we start off 2020 with a discussion on privacy by design. In the news segment, a Cisco advisory reminds us that the OWASP Top 10 is alive and well. Python reminds us that version 2 should be dead and buried. Then we look at DevOps security goals for 2020 and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV courses live and on demand, so there's no need to send staff to off-site training. Team subscriptions include Pro Portal, so managers have full control over your team's training schedule. Go to itpro.tv/ASW and use the code ASW30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly, and welcome to a new year. This is episode 90, recorded January 6th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shema, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hey, Matt.
Happy New Year, Mike.
Happy New Year. And it looks like you've got a new background, a new place. Is that true?
I am in the new house, closed on December 6th, yeah, and still working through it. It's been a month, but it's coming together back there. We're getting there. So this will kind of be the new look from now on. No more brick wall.
No more brick wall, but still lots of Matt Alderman, so that's good news. We don't have John with us, but he will be back for throughout the year. So, John, if you're listening, we already miss you, so come back soon. We'd also, speaking of welcoming people, we'd also like to welcome our new sponsor, GuardSquare. And then we have some announcements. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, March 30 through April 1st at the Disney Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World Main Conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW2020 and click the register button to register with our discount code. Our next webcast is January 15th with Cecilia Marinier, RSAC Program Director, Innovation and Scholars, where we will discuss the RSA Sandbox, Innovation Sandbox, Launchpad, Security Scholar, and their how-to seminar for innovators and entrepreneurs. Register for our upcoming webcast by visiting securityweekly.com. Select the webcast drop-down from the top menu bar and click registration. Well, Matt, it's January here in California, which also means the California Consumer Protection Act, or Privacy Act, has gone into effect. So this is sort of it's going to become, I think, the United States version of the EU's GDPR. And with that, I figured we'd start talking about some privacy by design. And one of the reasons I was thinking of that is that in 2019, we ended up the year talking a lot about API security and protecting data and how, what the OWASP API security top 10 looks like. And if we look at a concept like privacy by design, I think that's a great overlap in both the sense of protecting data, but asking a little bit more specific questions of what are we actually doing with that data? And so real quick, before we, let me read through some of the 7 foundational principles real quick, and then we can start to talk about some overlaps. So the idea of privacy by design, generally speaking, is to say, privacy, it should be proactive and not reactive. Sounds very much like a security principle right there. Privacy should be the default. Also, sounds like a good security principle. Privacy should be embedded into the design. Once again, sounds like a good security principle. It should be full functionality. And what that really means, we can talk about in a little bit, is that we shouldn't be crippling or weakening an application by removing some of its features just as teasers to say, weaken your privacy just to get access to these particular capabilities. One of the other things it calls out is end-to-end security throughout the lifecycle of an application. So I think that's a very direct theme, right, for our every time we talk about DevSecOps. Then the 2 last ones, visibility and transparency, meaning how is data being used, who has access to that data, and respect for user privacy, which I think we could also call out respect for user security as we are building applications. So I don't know if any, of those seven, if any one of those in particular, resonates with you the most, or really calls to mind the ways we've been talking about securing web applications.
Let's start with the principle first, because we did this with security, right? Security by design. We've been talking
Yeah.
about security by design for a long, long time in the industry. But where are we really when we think about this, right? So great concept, don't get me wrong, but it parallels what we try to do in security. And I don't think we fully accomplished that from a security perspective. So it's great to talk about this, but the question is, how quickly can we adopt this concept? Because we haven't even adopted the security by design concept we've been talking about for almost 10 plus years now. All these are great points. Don't get me wrong. I'm not sure the industry is going to move fast enough, even with CCPA and GDPR in place, by the way, to address privacy quickly enough to address a lot of these principles that are laid out in this design doc. So let's put all that aside for a second, right? Because like I said, I see this parallel, and so I want us to all be realistic about expectations. But when I look at this, there's some interesting ones in here where I think visibility and transparency in this concept of full functionality, zero positive sum, not zero sum, are really interesting concepts from a privacy perspective, because these are things that we see a lot of technology providers do to limit how people gain access to the free version and use that as a carrot to get them to a paid version. And this is in direct conflict to the way we're used to doing this in the industry.
Yeah, all fantastic points. And to also reinforce what you just said there at the end, if I remember the URL correctly, sso.tax is just another example of the security community pointing out to a bunch of like B2B SaaS apps that basically say, sure, if you want to roll SSO into your organization with our app, you need to pay for the enterprise version. It doesn't come for free. And again, that definitely is there's a big question there: is why should security that's that basic and fundamental be at a premium? And I think it does speak to, I won't say you're necessarily pessimistic about it, but a good realistic take that, security by design and the security fundamentals are still a long time coming. And we've been talking them for a long time. And even if we look at the OWASP top 10 or the API security top 10, they call it alternately sensitive data exposure or excessive data exposure. And that's probably the closest those come to even touching on privacy topics. So if we've had the security mindset for a long time and we're just starting to worry about, updating the privacy policies for GDPR and CCPA, there's probably a long road to go. Because I think one of the other things I wanted to point out too is that we've had some great discussions throughout the last year about different, cloud tools or going cloud native and how that benefits security. There are some pitfalls too. Mistakes can be a bit more egregious if you're talking about S3 buckets or Elasticsearch. But if we talk about cloud native or cloud controls for privacy, they're not quite as obvious. We could look at possibly some things like Google has a DLP service, and AWS has a similar one called Macy, which basically says we can, root around in your data and look for things that look like social security numbers or other types or email addresses or full names, things like that. That's just really more of a reactive approach right now, and it's not really addressing that proactive or that by design aspect of privacy.
Yeah, I think the big challenge here is, as humans, we have given up certain aspects of our privacy to use software. I'm gonna talk about Facebook later today on Business Security Weekly and some of the challenges they face in 2019. And a lot of this boils down to security and privacy. But see, we as consumers have been willing to give up aspects of our privacy for a number of years. The genie's out of the bottle. It's really hard to put it back in the bottle. Now, regulations are out there. In CCPA will be a very interesting component of what's going to happen in the US and what ultimately happens from a privacy regulation. Are we going to end up with 50? or are we going to end up with one federal law or whatever? But we've given up a lot of our privacy as consumers already. And so you've got a lot of solutions out there that have already figured out how to leverage this data, sell this data, use this data. And now all of a sudden we want to start thinking about privacy by design. It's a little late, right? And so this is why I'm a little pessimistic about this approach, is because we've already given up a bunch of this data, except for some of us who have decided that we didn't want to. But this is really difficult to peel back, I think, and now start over when I start to design my software.
Yeah, it's definitely, you're definitely right. The genie's out of the bottle, so we can't quite put that back in. But we can hopefully, if we go down the route, we can call it perhaps harm reduction and try to say, let's at least minimize and not make things worse, in the sense of, as well as calling out what technical controls can there be. Because you're right to point out that if we were to look at something like passwords, so there's a password breach, or you go to a site like Have I Been Pwned, losing a password can be consequential if if you're sharing that password amongst accounts. But if you just have that one password, it gets exposed, great. You can rotate passwords, you can apply MFA, and your account is still protected. But you can't really do the same thing with your phone number, with your GPS coordinates from your Fitbit, or your or whatever other device you have. You can sort of maybe do that with your email address and use a unique email address per site, but wow, does that become tiresome and difficult. We've seen a couple things where Apple, for example, with the new iOS release, has made small steps towards that, being able to say, here are unique email addresses that you can actually provide to websites during the for your authentication credentials. So here's a unique email, and then have your password manager choose a unique password. So that's a good start, but it really is just a drop in the bucket, and it doesn't address the larger issue about the rest of our personal information. So I do see this as a way of looking forward to stop the bleeding, if you will, and fix things in the future, but it's definitely not cleaning up all of the tracking, user tracking, browser tracking that still happens, that's been going on for the past 10, if not, quite honestly, 20 years of the web.
Yeah, agreed. We've had this discussion internally. People always want to know, can we identify unique downloads? No, we can't. You know why? Because I don't cookie my users. When you go to securityweekly.com, we made a conscious decision. We weren't going to track that user activity. So I can't associate download content and other things to a specific user. That is not the norm. That is the exception. Everybody cookies a user because they want to know who's coming to their website, who's visiting, what data are they accessing, right? This has been something that marketing teams have done for 15, 20 plus years. And to your point, right? It's hard to kind of peel that back. So what are some of the controls we can put in place to start to add more privacy controls into our applications? Because again, some of these, it's too late. These applications already exist. This is a great roadmap maybe for a new application where you want to build privacy in by design. But for those apps that are existing, I think what we have to think about, Mike, is a common set of controls that we can use to protect the data that's already been collected. So things like encryption. How do we encrypt that data? How do we allow data not to be collected, whether we can go back and remove certain data out of the database, right? The data side of this. Those are some of the things that I think we have to logically look at and say, can we put now certain controls in place that protect the data we have, or allow users to remove that data from the system so we don't have to protect it? Then eventually, as we think about iterations of our designs for our software going forward, we can start to think about some of these privacy principles in them. But I think it's really tough.
Yeah, I think it's good that you're highlighting those, because it helps to highlight where this is a good overlap with security. So encryption, for example, encrypting data at rest, whether it's full disk encryption, so you can do something like crypto shredding and delete an instance and not worry about that the data can be accessible otherwise. Same thing with encrypting S3 buckets, so that sure, if there is an SSRF through your WAF that gets IAM credentials and then leaks that bucket, if it's encrypted data, then the impact hopefully is going to be significantly reduced. Also, you're talking about one of the terms of art in privacy by design is data minimization, and you were essentially saying that also in the idea that if you don't collect the data, then you aren't going to have that data exposed in a breach, or you don't have to protect, you don't have to protect what you don't collect. So there are some good security principles here. And one of the things is I added a link to how to read a privacy policy. And one of the reasons I added it in there is that some of the questions were kind of a good way to threat model a privacy approach. So when we've done some security threat modeling, we go through those standard questions, or what are you building? What could go wrong? What are you going to do about it? And then how well did you do? You could apply those to privacy topics, but you could also be, a little bit more straightforward or a little bit more focused in kind of to what you were describing about how Security Weekly approaches just cookies, for example, saying what's being collected, how is it collected, why is it collected, and how is that going to be used? And so those are pretty good questions to start off with to sort of threat model the data that you're collecting. And then you could either take that and say, we want to go down the privacy design path and figure some aspects around that, or let's go down the security path and then figure out how are we adding controls to access controls, logging, and making sure that we're logging access, but we're not actually logging PII, so we're actually spreading PII throughout all of our log stashes as well. So I think there's some good conversations that security folks, as well as privacy engineering folks, which is a growing role within the industry, could have with their DevOps teams.
Yeah, that logging one is, I'm pretty sure that was a Facebook issue last year where they were actually putting the passwords, I think, in the logs or something like that, and that's how they exposed a bunch of those passwords. There are obviously ways to protect that data so that you don't make it available in something like a clear text log as part of your system. So, those are really good security principles as well as they are privacy principles. But you're right. These are some of the challenges, and most people, I wrote our privacy policy, right? I know what we collect and why we collect it, and when we do it, it's primarily around our interest lists and for webcasts today. That may change a little bit when we do the member site, but the rest of this we try not to really collect in because, again, if I collect it, I have to protect it, and sometimes I don't want to be in that game, right? In trying to protect a bunch of data that I collected. So, we're pretty conscious about what we collect and what we store, and then obviously how to protect that appropriately. I think more organizations, need to spend the time not only evaluating this from their privacy policy, but, as they collect that data, how are they going to protect it? Because in our, as a podcast, right, in reaching a big audience, and not collecting that data has its downsides to us in some respects, but it does allow us to not have to worry about exposing private data. But a lot of people will ask us, where do we store this data? How do we store it, et cetera? And luckily, in most cases, I say, we don't collect it, so we don't store it. There's a few exceptions to that, obviously, but that makes it a lot easier to respond to privacy questionnaires that are going to become more common for businesses as part of a third-party review process. We did this with security. We've done this with security for 20 plus years now, almost. I think what you're going to start to see is a lot of people asking more and more questions on the privacy front as part of third-party vendor analysis and risk assessments, because they want to know what data is exposed. And so you could see a whole new set of privacy questions come into these reviews that third parties will do on a regular basis now.
Yeah, and that'll be interesting because I think we're definitely beyond the point where we're just saying, do you have a WAF, or how are you handling CSRF? Do you have, 2FA enabled on your site? Those are some pretty basic, third-party kind of security risk questionnaires, but they're kind of really ultra basic. And it's not necessarily a new concept to say, do you have a data flow diagram? Now, admittedly, I don't think many people have a very accurate one because it's hard to keep up, or even, a data classification. Again, that predates the concepts of CCPA and GDPR. These are some basic security approaches to have because you're trying to figure out what should be encrypted, what doesn't need to be encrypted, as well as what access controls should be. And when you're talking about what organizations should be thinking of, you mentioned, for example, Facebook. Facebook, Twitter, both were, accidentally logged passwords. They also were in the news for insider threat, and this is something else that probably should be on the radar, if it hasn't been already, for many organizations, is insider threat. And then because you have employees, contractors, or other people that fall under that umbrella of insider who have access to this data. So if that hasn't been in your threat model, figuring that out now is quite important, because especially when we talk about the idea of zero trust networks, we've gone well beyond the idea of the network as a perimeter, and we've gone more toward what are the asset, where is the data stored, and what is the attestation of the device accessing that. And if you've created basically that idea of everybody on your internal network is equally trusted and trustable, that's not necessarily the right mentality to approach in these types of zero trust networks and designing stronger, more secure applications.
Yeah. And this is where the overlap into the API, OWASP top 10 API security requirements come in, because to your point, we can't rely on the network anymore. The perimeter is really me as a person interacting with an application that has access to data. And a lot of that interaction is happening through APIs. It's happening via a mobile app on my phone, via an API to a backend web service application that then is an API to some other source, right? And so that's where some of these things start to get really interesting from an overlap perspective, because now what we see is the challenges when it comes to API security have a pretty big impact when it comes to potentially privacy implications, because that's how I'm gaining access to a lot of these different data sources. And if I'm not locking down that full chain of interaction, then that's how a privacy breach is going to happen.
Yeah, and I think this is where I think when we start to talk about APIs, I think we can start to introduce and discuss how cloud native or things like serverless perhaps can help us. And the angle I'm looking for there is, if we take the API security, two of them that stand out to me as overlap here are the broken object level authorization and broken function level authorization. So this is talking about like IDOR, if we're talking about the old OWASP top 10 nomenclature for this. But it's basically, as a user, am I only getting access to my own account data, as well as at the service level, when we're talking about a bunch of microservices or even third-party services interacting with each other, are these services locked down? And this is where I think we'll see a lot more focus and granularity on IAM within the cloud, which is a theme we've touched on a lot, as well as if we start to talk about serverless. One of the things that might be interesting there is, rather than saying, here's the IAM roles for this entire microservice in this container, maybe we could even start to get even more granular to say, here's this one function, and this function has this, basically needs only a read-only access to certain data or write-only access. And you can start to enforce that at the function level, which is a lot easier to do when you're talking about lambdas than it would be within a bunch of different functions within one monolithic Java program. So I do think there's some interesting things we can see emerge from these patterns, but I don't know that we're quite there yet from a design, from a deployment, and how many organizations have adopted this.
Yeah, because that would limit excess data exposure by forcing the Lambda functions to have access to specific pieces of data. So you kind of create this kind of segmentation in your functions to segment what data can, and then you can't get excess data. From an architectural perspective, it's really interesting. I think the challenge is people aren't deploying in the cloud that way, right? They're deploying to RDS and they're doing the same things they've always done, where the application has access to maybe the ability to get to all the data in the database, or you've got an S3 bucket where data is residing, but there's no lockdown or segmentation of what has access to what. Serverless Lambda functions may be a way to architecturally get us there, but I don't see that as the predominant deployment mechanism in the cloud right now. And so all the things we did in the data center are still applicable at the database or the file object level.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely a lot easier for me to say we can have granular IAM permissions on a Lambda function than it is to actually go through and enumerate explicitly what those are, and then do that for the next function and the next function, the next function. Because, a REST API, could have, even if it just has, call it relatively small, say it has 30 endpoints on it. That's a lot of review. It's a lot of testing. It's a lot of making sure that did we actually get to least privilege or did we get to mostly least privilege? Which, again, a great security concept. It's a good privacy by design concept as well. And least privilege has to be at least, I want to say, 40 years old. If I'm trying to think back to the old Orange Book and those types of what's the word? InfoSec archaeology or ancient history.
Yeah, we covered a little bit of that in the last segment of the year. But yes, these concepts have been around for a long, long time. I'm getting old, Mike. We just haven't we haven't practiced what we've preached for 20 plus years.
Yes. Well, my hope here is that with this privacy by design that we're starting to preach with a little bit more clarity, perhaps. So rather than just say encrypt all the things or, protect the data, we're actually saying how it should be protected. And we're talking about a couple things like I did reference like data minimization, how it's being used, how it's being retained. You called out too. Can it be deleted? That's another good thing about it. And then we're also just talking about who are the people managing the system, who has developed the system. Everyone needs a good or probably needs a good type of customer success or customer support or whatever the current phrase is for that type of role. But that role needs access to customer data quite often. So that needs to be protected. Or there are other things that need to be done to investigate fraud, for example. So fraud analysis needs to look at patterns of access from IP addresses, email accounts. Or is someone actually running through a credential stuffing account? So we don't necessarily, it's not that we need to blind ourselves, so to speak, from a security perspective in terms of not looking at activity, not looking at this type of data. It's just a matter of being more clear and about what we're collecting and how we're going to use it.
Fully agreed.
So I think with that, unless there is any final addendums or something else, a lessons learned perhaps as you were going through writing out Security Weekly's privacy policy, I think this is a good start off to the year. And this is a topic, privacy and more likely data protection is something that I think we're going to be revisiting quite a bit, hopefully on the security by design angle and not so much on the breach angle. But I'm definitely not going to cross my fingers on that one.
Yeah, I think we're going to cover a lot of this on Security and Compliance Weekly on Tuesdays going forward, now that CCPA has been in effect. And, we'll see how this plays out. It'll be interesting, but we're going to cover aspects of compliance and the privacy side over there as well. But it's definitely going to play into all of our shows, I think, just because we're going to see more and more news articles about this kind of stuff going forward.
Awesome. Well, so there we are. So you have Application Security Weekly on Monday, and then you can listen to Security and Compliance Weekly on Tuesdays. Sounds like we're growing the family. That's awesome. Thanks, Matt. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to return with news of the week.